My name is Steve Johnston, co-founder of nonprofit A Race Against Blindness. Our mission is to support advocacy, awareness, and support clinical trials for rare and ultra-rare diseases. As a part of our awareness and advocacy mission, we are bringing educational series to our listeners that may help them learn and understand more about the conditions we represent. Today, I have a conversation with Dr. Jeremy Pomeroy from the Marshfield Clinic. I hope you enjoy it. All right, Dr. Pomeroy, thank you so much for being here. It's been a long time coming. We've been trying to get this on the books for a while. But I'm really excited to tell your story and tell the BBS community about what the Marshfield Clinic is and what you guys offer. Before we dig into that, I want to just learn a little bit more about you and tell the listeners who you are, what your background is, and how you got involved in BBS care.
Sure. Well, thanks. I'm glad to be here. So, my background, actually, I started my research career in health psychology.
Okay.
And then I really started focusing more on type 2 diabetes and obesity, and I worked in an Indian community that just south of Phoenix, Arizona, and they have exceptionally high rates of type 2 diabetes and obesity, and through that process I got to work with some individuals from the intramural research program of the National Institute of Diabetes, Digestive, and Kidney Diseases, and so then I realized that I wanted to get a PhD, and a lot of it was because I was getting asked questions that we didn't have answers to, and so I wanted to try to find those answers, and so I did my PhD kind of jointly with the NIDDK and ASU, and got that in 2009, and then after that I continued to work at the NIDDK for a few years, and then in 2015, my wife and I decided we were ready to relocate. And so I have family. My younger sister and her family live in Marshfield, Wisconsin.
Okay.
And so I was being recruited when they found out that I was interested in moving there, and I was invited to give a talk. And at that talk, there was a pediatric nephrologist by the name of Dr. Bob Hawes. And afterwards, he met with me and he said, "Have you ever heard of BBS?" And I said, "Yes." And he was surprised. And so we just talked a little bit about the program he had there, and they had a multi-specialty care center for people with BBS. They had just started a registry at that point. Mm-hmm. It was only maybe a little bit over a year old at that time, and he was talking a little bit about what they wanted to do, and I thought, hey, this sounds really cool. I didn't know about it before I had the interview, but that was like, oh wow, this may be something that I changed my career for, and come. And so my wife and I both relocated, moved to Marshfield, and I brought a lot of projects with me, so it was a process of devoting more and more of my time to BBS. But starting in around 2017, 2018, I really kind of got focused and initiated a couple projects myself. And then a couple years ago, Dr. Hawes, Bob Hawes, retired, and he came to me and a few others and said, "Well, who's going to replace me?" And we said, "No one person will." And there was a team of 4 of us that took over. But my role, I took over the registry, the clinical registry investigating Bardet-Biedl Syndrome, the largest clinical registry of people with BBS in the world. And I'm the science guy. We have some clinicians, a psychologist, and then the coordinator of our center that are the rest of the leadership team, and we've kind of gone from there.
Great. Yeah, that's a fascinating story. I actually didn't know all that, so that's really cool to hear. So Dr. Hawes is a name that's familiar to the community for people who've been around it for a while, but that's a great segue into the history of the Marshfield Clinic, the CRIBS registry. So can you give us just kind of a little foundational history of how it got started and how long the Marshfield Clinic has been around, and then we can kind of get into more what the services are and what it's all about.
Sure. So Dr. Hawes had this dream of starting this center for people with BBS. He had a patient with BBS that he diagnosed at birth, and this family, kind of said, "We like you. We want you to be our doctor."
Yeah.
And I can understand why.
Yeah.
I mean, knowing Bob Hawes, and so this was kind of become a passion of his, and so then finally, I think it was around 2013. At the Marshfield Clinic, he was able to get started with these multi-specialty clinics. And then around in 2014, he was working very closely with the BBS Foundation, the largest advocacy organization in the U.S. and Canada for people with BBS, and they said, to really move research forward, we need a registry.
Yep.
And so they started the registry, and that was kind of how everything started.
Cool. So it's been around for a number of years now. What is the Multispecialty Clinic at Marshfield, and what are the general services that it provides for people with BBS?
Yeah, so what the Multispecialty clinics are is, so this is a place where people with BBS can come and get, all or most of the care that they need all in one visit by clinicians that have seen a lot of cases with BBS.
Yep.
And so what we do is we have these specific clinic weeks. People can come outside of those. I mean, we don't ever say, no, you can't come.
Yeah.
But the defined clinic weeks have a couple of advantages. So someone, coming for these clinic weeks may see 20 to 30 specialists.
Yep.
And so coordinating all of those visits, all those appointments is can be challenging. And so that's one of the reasons why we do these defined weeks. We set aside all the specialist schedules until all of the appointments are made, and then they can open it up to people that don't have BBS.
Sure.
We have a coordinator that helps people are traveling from all over the world.
Yep.
And so things like insurance can be difficult to negotiate and navigate. And so she helps with that. And then, at these, we do things kind of to structure so that, someone that comes in, they only get weighed once.
Yep.
They only get their blood pressure, maybe multiple times, but only if it's really necessary.
Sure.
If someone who wants to see, they get all these things. Every doctor they see has seen other people with BBS,
Yep.
usually that day. And then one of the things I think that we do that's really cool about these defined clinic weeks is there's this local family that has 2 children with BBS. They organize a dinner. And so for a lot of the patients coming for their first visit, they've never met someone with BBS before. So they get to at these dinners. They talk, they ask questions. I usually attend, some of the other clinicians attend, so they can ask us questions. And it's just a really, organic conversation about what's it like living with BBS.
Yep.
And so we do that as well. We hold these clinic weeks. Our first one actually this year's coming up in a couple weeks. We usually start them in April.
Okay.
Not in the deep winter of
So you're
Wisconsin.
saying you don't send people to Wisconsin in the dead of winter?
Imagine people don't want to come, so
Okay.
I understand. And then they last through generally November.
Okay, sounds good. So this is one of those topics that I think people who are just getting their first diagnosis is, where do I start? How do I begin? So I'm a family member who just got this diagnosis for myself or my child. And I've now been on the internet, I've been researching about BBS, and I come across Marshfield Clinic. How do I get an appointment? How do I get in to be seen? And walk me through those steps of what it takes to actually get into a clinic with you guys.
Yeah, so if someone's found the Multispecialty Clinic page, then it has a couple different ways to contact us and reach out about getting an appointment. We have a phone number, we have a email address, and all that kind of stuff. And so then what happens is when they reach out to us, they are put in that goes to our coordinator. Her name's Tara. She's phenomenal. She's a nurse, and she also coordinates another clinic for children with complex medical needs. So she's got a lot of experience, and she's very experienced in BBS. And so she starts the process, and she finds out what the needs are. Not every person with BBS has the same needs, so they might not need to see all the same specialists and all of that. And so that's really the kind of the heart of the process is her getting things started.
Cool. Yeah, I think that was because I have a son with BBS, so we've been through that process ourselves. And I remember that was one of the most daunting tasks, is like, where do we begin? Where do we start? So I think, we take it for granted that this exists and that this is a thing, but there's a lot of people out there every day who are out there learning about this for the first time. So how they get in there and get seen, I think, is an important reminder to have out there for everybody to make sure that access is there for them. So once the appointment's made, what does that actual, is it a clinic day, or is it a multi-day event, or what's kind of the logistics once you come out to Marshfield, and what does that whole schedule look like?
Yeah, so generally it's 2 to 3 days.
Okay.
Occasionally it's up to 4, kind of depending. There's sometimes, something like, if a sleep study needs to be scheduled the first time, it didn't go so well, and so that might carry over. But generally speaking, let's say 3 days is I would say the typical. And so, it's Monday through Wednesday. The patient usually will arrive on Sunday. Monday morning, they're met by the the coordinator, who kind of lay out, this is the, the plan, this is what's going to go on, kind of some reassurances. This is going to be a different experience. This is not where you're telling a doctor I have BBS. They look at you blankly, they leave the room, they go Google it, and they come back in. They know BBS and kind of get, let them know what's going to go on, let them know about the dinner, which is usually on Monday nights. And then we often have volunteers to help, because most people have never been to the Marshfield Clinic campus, and it's not, a huge daunting campus, but still, like any medical center, finding your way around. So we have volunteers to help guide them, and all of that, and multiple check-ins throughout the day as they see how things are going, and that's just, then the clinic just kind of goes through, and if sometimes a new issue will come up. And so that we'll shuffle things around and get someone scheduled, and just try to make sure that their needs are met. We realize that a lot of the patients who come, this may be the only time they can come to the Marshfield Clinic, and so we want them to be prepared to, when they go back, to maybe educate their home care. We also volunteer to be a resource for their home care, and so that they can continue to achieve the optimal medical care that they can, even if they're not receiving it from us.
Yeah, and that was exactly my next question, which is this a one-time thing where you come out and see the Marshfield Clinic once and you never come back? Or are you potentially coming there on a regular basis annually for your continued follow-up care? Or is there some sort of hybrid mix that exists for people?
Yeah, and these are somewhat made-up numbers, but it's probably about 60% it's one time.
Yeah.
And then 40% that come multiple times, and sometimes it's every 2 years, sometimes it's less, some come every year. And there are patients that are in, within let's say a 4-hour drive of Marshfield. They may come more than once every year. They may come during a defined clinic week, but also outside of those as well.
Okay. Now, I remember when we went through the clinic a few years ago, we left with a binder. It was basically all the records. There was a summary sheet that kind of gave a little overview of like, okay, these are the findings, these are the general recommendations, and that kind of became our guide for when we came back home to our doctors who've never heard of BBS and don't know what to do. But it gave them a little bit of a summary of how to approach these things on a regular basis. Is that still the case, or has that evolved, or what did they leave clinic with?
Yeah, so very much that is still the case, because we found that is really very important and helpful. So the binder will include things like, these are the follow-up tests that should be done. Yep. This is the interval when they should be done. And this is sort of what, so that they can hand it to a doctor and say, this is what you need to know to provide me or my child care.
Yep. Perfect. Yeah, and I can say that binder had been very helpful when we were first coming back and needing to establish follow-up, because like you mentioned a few times, it's just the reality is most of the clinicians don't have any experience with it. They may have never heard of it, so they don't know what to do. So this is a really valuable resource. So that so for people who are feeling like, oh my gosh, I'm not going to be able to get good care, I'm not going to be able to, I don't know how to handle this once I get out of here, that's a really good almost Bible to just hang on to. And then, it's just a reassuring thing. I know we left clinic feeling like, going into it, we were like kind of lost and confused. We came out feeling a little more reassured that there was hope, that there was, going to be good care options. So yeah, it's a phenomenal experience going in there. And I'm glad that hopefully this can provide a little bit more of a awareness for people who are thinking about, should I come to Marshfield and everything. With what we know about BBS, the numbers that are currently out there, how many people with BBS do you think have been to the Marshfield Clinic, and how many more are out there in, like, let's say US and Canada that we think probably have a diagnosis of BBS, but they've never been to the Marshfield Clinic or don't even know let's just say, haven't been to the Marshfield Clinic? Yeah,
well, so we've had probably around 170 unique patients that have ever been to the Marshfield Clinic. Okay. In Cribs, there are around 580 people from the U.S. alone. We estimate that there's probably around 4,000 to 5,000 people in the U.S. that have BBS. Yep. There probably are a lot that are not diagnosed. Yep. So we, in terms of people when the age that they're diagnosed in Cribs, and just from my experience, some in utero. Yep. And then the oldest was 78. Yeah. So, and everything in between. Yes. And so, I think that there probably are a lot of undiagnosed people, but of the people, there are people, the ones that we're really, we'd like people that need a diagnosis to get a diagnosis. Yep. but also there's those people that are newly diagnosed that maybe haven't found the Marshfield Clinic, haven't found the BBS Foundation either. You know, that's that awareness so that they know that there are resources, and that so that they can reach out. And you know, we do, you know, people that have been diagnosed for years, and then they, you know, they register for cribs, and you know, it's amazing the journey that they've had to start to get, you know, expert care.
Yep. And obviously, you know, we as a nonprofit and us as a community in general, that is one of, I think, the, you know, topics of how do we do better at this, you know, to get the awareness out there to people who have this. These resources exist. These are the things that are available. These are the clinics that you can go to. So I know that that's one of the hot topics in our, you know, kind of world that we're all working towards doing more with. So you've mentioned the word cribs a few times. Like everything else related to this, it's a very familiar word to you and I because we're very involved in this. But what is cribs? What does it mean? And why should people be, you know, interested in getting involved with cribs?
Yeah, so cribs is the clinical registry investigating Bardet-Biedl Syndrome. And so this was a registry that was started as a collaboration between Bob Hawes and Tim Ogden from the BBS Foundation and Family Association. Back in the first interview was conducted in June of 2014.
Okay.
And so the way that cribs works is that there are a couple different ways that someone can register. And then once they register, then there's a little bit of a process to make sure that they actually have BBS.
Yep.
And you know, so we ask about the clinical diagnosis, about genetic confirmation. They don't need genetic confirmation. There's a lot of people that have clinical diagnosis but don't have genetic confirmation. But if they have the clinical diagnosis, then they are enrolled in cribs. And the way that works is we have 2 expert interviewers. Both are bilingual in English and Spanish. And they conduct either the interview with the parent or caregiver or the person with BBS themselves, kind of depending on age and so on. That initial health interview can take a couple hours because it's an extensive health history, kind of go through system by system of common, you know, areas that are impacted by BBS, ask a lot about family history, about the BBS diagnosis, the kind of the diagnostic journey and all of that. And then we also asked, you know, about where people received their medical care. And so then what we do is we seek out the medical record information from that. We don't put the burden on people to share that with us, that we do the work to get that information, because there's a lot of value in that. And then every year after that, our goal is to do a follow-up interview. Those follow-ups are often, you know, can be briefer because it's sort of not what has happened throughout your life, but it's what's happened since the last time we spoke. We do introduce some new questions, you know, kind of about health and well-being. You know, hunger is a big issue with people with BBS, and so we have some questionnaires around hunger to kind of try to understand. You know, and then so now we're just getting ready to roll out a new follow-up interview, and you know, we kind of take into account, you know, what is the community interested in to start to ask in those questions.
Yep. So cribs is, just to summarize, it's a registry that's getting information about people with BBS. It's storing it in a private, you know, clinical database, and then with that information, what can happen with it? What are the good things that can come from being a part of that registry? And are there any specific success stories related to cribs?
Yeah. So, you know, I think that there are probably a lot of things that can come from just being part of the registry. You know, I think that people who are part of it feel the contribution, you know, that they're helping the community. And you know, I think the other thing is that I mean, our interviewers are phenomenal. Yeah. They've been great, and they just enjoy speaking with them. Yeah. And you know, one of our interviewers has children with BBS herself. Right. And so, you know, it's an opportunity to just interact with someone else who's informed about BBS.
Yep.
They can ask questions. Often that the interviewers will reach out to me and say, hey, you know, I talked to somebody today, they have a question. I'll answer questions for anybody. You don't have to be in cribs for me to do that, but that's a good way to get that connected. Yep. Then, you know, the registry, the information that we gather is a tremendous resource. So there are over 1,000 people that are registered. not all of those have even done the initial interview yet. And so, we're getting close to about 800 people that have done at least an initial interview. And so we've used that data to look at a number of different questions. Historically, one of the first things, because, Dr. Hawes was a nephrologist, he was interested in kidney transplants.
Yep.
People with BBS, not a huge proportion, but people with BBS need kidney transplants. And he wanted to know, how does it turn out?
Sure.
And so that was a very early process. Another one was kind of interesting because it was that we had a couple of clinicians that said, on ultrasounds, we've had a couple of patients come back where their organs are not in the usual places. And they said, is this a BBS thing? And, so what we found out that it is, but this is, this issue happens in, far less than 1% of people without BBS.
Yeah.
It happened in, 2% of people with BBS. So it's still very, very rare, but because of registry the size of Cribs, we can identify these things. We've had some papers about kidney failure. And understanding, that's a big concern. Often I think, a new parent gets a diagnosis. Vision is one that they're really focused on. Kidney is another one. What's going to happen to my child's kidneys? And so this was an important paper to, kind of better understand who is impacted by kidney failure. A paper that I worked on very early was looking at weight patterns in children. And I think that was really important for helping to get the approval of a drug to treat, for weight management. Really, the real important purpose of that drug is the hunger, and showing the need. I think that initially was looking at only in ages 12 and up, and we showed that there was a need to ages 2 and up. And so I think that was one, and one that actually is starting to get some attention now that I did a study very early where I looked, used an objective measure. So, kind of like a Fitbit or something, but a research grade, where the people wore it on their wrist for 12 days and we measured their sleep and physical activity. I did this in children and adults with BBS. And what we found was that almost as a rule, people with BBS don't get good duration of sleep. They short sleep. And their quality is not great either.
Sure.
And that, we wanted to know, well, what can we do to improve that? And so now, I think it's getting more attention. And it's important, too, that with this treatment for hunger, because one of the things that can impact sleep is if you're hungry, it's hard to sleep.
Sure.
And so now we have that kind of baseline data that we can now follow up and say, is this improving people's sleep? And so that was another, I think, success as well.
Yeah. So you mentioned the hunger medication. So setmelanotide, obviously FDA approved for this treatment of hunger in patients with BBS. How did that come about, and what was the role that Cribs played in getting that drug researched and approved?
Yeah, so it was kind of a funny experience, actually. So Rhythm Pharmaceuticals, a representative from Rhythm came to us and said, we've got this protocol. It's called a basket study, where it was in people with BBS and some other rare syndromes that they thought would benefit from the medication. They said, do you think you could find 5 people? And we said, well, the problem is we have 500 who would love to be in this study. So how are we going to narrow it down? And so we kind of, was Dr. Hawes and I, and we kind of entered a negotiation. I don't think they realized they were going to be negotiating, but so we did try to get them to include as many patients. And then also they said, okay, this is going to be for age 12 and up. And said, well, would you give us 2 and up? And they said, well, how about 6 and up? And so, the roles that Cribs played. So number one is that we helped recruit. The other is that when you're trying to get FDA approval for a rare drug, you don't do these huge studies where some people get the drug and some don't. It's natural history is kind of the key, is you have to say, is the impact of this drug, whatever it be, in this case, it's weight loss, is this different than people in the community, just their natural history? And so Cribs provided that data. And so that was a big component too, and it is kind of an ongoing. And I think then the other two is that showing the need, that it was really, the need started. And honestly, I mean, I would love for primary prevention under age 2, but we really saw that age 2 was about the time that we saw the huge increase in excess weight.
Yeah, I can provide a little extra commentary there to really emphasize the importance of being involved in CRIBS if you have BBS or your family member has BBS, because my nonprofit organization, we're very focused on funding research, and funding rare disease research is incredibly hard. And the powers that be that are researching these things, every single roadblock is another reason for them to not fund research for these rare diseases such as BBS. And one of the big concerns they always have is like, are there going to be enough patients for this clinical trial? Are they going to be interested, and do we have good data on this patient population? So having a resource like CRIBS, where there's tons of people who are in it, there's great clinical data out of it, that removes that roadblock. So there's going to be other roadblocks with funding, all these other things that they got to do, but just having that off the table, they're like, okay, there is this population, there is this good resource that we can follow with, and that's a huge asset to the community to ensure that a rare disease like BBS is going to get the attention it needs to get research, which a lot of other diseases and communities don't have. So just to reiterate, it's super important to get involved with CRIBS if you have a diagnosis of BBS or a family member has a diagnosis of BBS, because it will continue to advance the new treatments and care that exists. So that kind of segues me to a question that I wanted to throw at you. So 10 years ago, BBS, there was really nothing that could be done for people with BBS. It was, okay, we know you have this thing. We will manage the sequela of all the problems you have. You're going to lose your vision. We'll help get you resources to learn how to function in low vision environments and how to become blind. You have hunger issues, and so we're going to deal with the sequela of those issues as they come up with weight gain and kidney problems and all these other things. It's just problem management. Now, fast forward now, we have one FDA-approved therapy that we talked about, and so there is actually a treatment now that exists for BBS, and the BBS Multispecialty Clinic exists, so there's comprehensive care that can exist. So the question I'm going to throw at you is, fast forward 10 years from now, what do you think care for people with BBS looks like in terms of specialty clinics, potential therapies or treatments? Nobody's going to hold you to it. It's obviously just kind of what's your vision for where this community is in the next 10 years from now?
Yeah, well, I very sincerely hope that there is at least one approved and really multiple approved treatments for vision loss.
Yes.
I think that we're really close.
Yep.
But it's felt like we're really close for a long time. And that's speaking as someone who doesn't have the skin in the game as a parent or someone themselves.
Yeah.
I think that's something. I think that what I really hope too is that, there are other kind of treatments that are more for the prevention of various things. And I it touched on it a little bit with setmelanotide and the prevention of, obesity instead of the treatment of, and working on that. And kind of understanding more about some of these treatments too, the broader impacts. I mean, with setmelanotide, one of the things that the hope and the idea was that it was going to treat the hunger, which, we call hyperphagia.
Yep.
And, we're seeing that, not surprisingly in retrospect is that, school performance is improving. We've seen mental health improvements. And so kind of understand too, what are some of the broader impacts of these, and so to help people with BBS maximize what they can achieve in life. That there was a lot of, if you look back at the literature and say, I'm not going to look at anything that is newer than 5 years old, and look back historically, that there were a lot of things about BBS that weren't right about the range of intellectual functioning. That there are a lot of people with BBS that, graduated from college and have graduate degrees and things like that. I mean, it's a spectrum. And to make sure that people aren't held back by expectations, that we tailor the treatments to their needs and to their capabilities. That's, those are the kind of things that I really am hopeful for.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, there's a palpable level of hope and positivity in the community, I think, for what, is already out there and what is to come. So I think, we as family members are all very appreciative that there's been so much work happening behind the scenes to this point to get it to this point, because and that's people like you who have been dedicating themselves to this before this was something that people would dedicate themselves to. So we are truly appreciative. So Marshfield has been that kind of role model for what comprehensive BBS care looks like. Is there anywhere else that patients with BBS can get comprehensive care, and what does that landscape look like for them?
Yeah. So, and I mean, kind of first internationally. So the BBS UK has really been groundbreaking, and they've had clinics for I don't know how many years, but for a long time, longer than Marshfield.
Okay.
And using sort of the structure of their health system has facilitated that. In the U.S., so Marshfield has been it for a long time. More recently, so the Mayo Clinic in Rochester has developed an interest, and I work very closely with them, and they've got a great team there, and they're really doing some great work. There are kind of some other individual providers that are, I think, in the process now, where maybe where Dr. Hawes was, 12 years ago, where they're starting to provide care, and they're going to attract the other specialists at their centers.
Yep.
And then, there are some other centers as a whole that are trying. One of the things is that they're all now in the Great Lakes region. Okay. I'd love to see some. I mean, I'm from the Great Lakes region, and that's great, but I, would like to see kind of some on the coasts and, in Texas. I mean, there's a lot of people with BBS in Texas. We know that from Cribs. Yep. There we go. And so, I think that I'd like to see that expand, and I'm hopeful that as, some of these other centers get online and they are successful, that will. I think, the other thing that does help is treatment. Yep. But I think one of the reasons why doctors really weren't that interested in specializing in it before is because, you could diagnose it, but then you couldn't treat it. Or you could, symptom management, but even that wasn't really that successful.
Sure.
And I think that, now where we have some treatments, and hopefully we have more treatments and things like that, I think that then people say, well, yeah, this is an opportunity for me to be successful in a niche area. I mean, there's something about that we're saying, you could be the world's foremost expert on this topic. That does attract people.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you work closely with the team at Mayo Rochester. What does that collaboration look like on kind of a clinical care level and also on the kind of foundational research level?
Yeah, so I provided some direct advice on sort of the clinical care. I also put them in touch with our clinicians and kind of to provide some recommendations. I also, on an individual basis to members of the BBS community have referred to people there, kind of depending. They have a really phenomenal ophthalmologist there and direct care in that way. Or, we have people coming from Minnesota and to say, well, you can cut a couple hours off your drive and go to another really phenomenal care. On the research side, so Dr. Seema Kumar is the pediatric endocrinologist there. I work very closely with her. We are actually working on a manuscript right now to look at glycemia, blood glucose levels in people with BBS and in children. She has a resident there that's quite interested, 2 residents actually, and so we're working on that. So not only is this project going to produce important results so that people understand risks of diabetes and things like that, but also I think we're recruiting some new clinicians. And that's always the goal too. I work with residents in Marshfield as well, and I also work with summer interns, and it's recruitment. And I tell them at the beginning, I am recruiting you. Yeah, that is why you don't have to. But actually, I've had a couple that they are now pursuing PhDs, and I think we're going to get them back.
Absolutely. Well, that's exciting. I mean, that's that's the dream is, you start to see these networks start to expand and grow out of what began as the Marshfield Clinic, and now you have others who are coming on board. To continue to ensure that happens, what resources are needed at a community level, whether it's nonprofits advocating for funding or, health systems, or what do we need to make sure that this ball keeps rolling downhill and we keep the momentum?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of clinical care, I think that kind of the advocacy locally, talk to your doctor about, recruit them to do this. I think, for these centers that do draw in, the people, I think, there are kind of just some structural healthcare challenges. Some of them are, Medicaid is very state focused. So if, you don't live in a state with, these, it's very, very hard to get Medicaid to cover that. Travel can be onerous, and there's certain things that these centers can do, but we're really limited in how we can provide help with travel, because that's considered inducing people to come, and we can't do that. Telehealth is an issue. It's the way that telehealth restrictions work is bizarre. And when people, I talk to people about it, I say, look, this isn't going to make sense. I'm going to tell you how it works, but it's not going to make sense because it doesn't make sense. So if there's more that we could do, so that if someone did have, their primary care doctor that was interested in Engage, but they needed to see a specialist via telehealth, right now we can't do that. Yeah. And so, those are all kind of structural things that would really be beneficial to help, so that there's these hybrid models of way people can get this expert care that they don't. I mean, we love having people come to Marshfield.
Of course.
And I think that there are some nice things about the community aspect of that, but we want to make sure that people can receive care wherever it works for them to receive it.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to summarize, I guess, it would be that obviously we need to continue to advocate just to make clinicians and researchers interested in this. So that's, kind of bar number one, make sure that that exists. The second being potentially some reforms, like make sure that telehealth is functionally, able to, deliver the care it needs. And, we live in such an advanced world now that, technology is there to allow care across state lines and all these different things, but the rules and regulations around it are maybe prohibiting that. Is that a correct kind of way of looking at it?
Yeah.
So some reforms there would be important. And then this is a question that kind of just came in my head as I was listening to it is, I know you guys can't help support travel costs, but if there was like a community effort, some sort of philanthropy around that, would there be ways to help people get to care that's not directly funded by the Marshfield, but maybe third-party organizations, anything like that? Would that be legally allowed and be helpful?
So as far as I know, it's a little bit of a disclaimer, but I know that some of the patients who have come to the Marshfield Clinic, they have received community support for it there. One big caveat, though, is that if they are someone whose care is covered by Medicaid, that they can't, because that they kind of count that as income.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so they could come, but then they wouldn't have Medicaid anymore.
So the people who need it most are not able to get the help they need because of that.
Yeah. And I mean, so I think Medicaid reform is the thing. And I have no expertise on how to do that. I could tell you some of the problems and how that could be fixed, but this isn't like a lot of health issues where you can find someone with that expertise in your state, often in your city. This is something where there are only a few places that have this care. And so realizing that maybe the one size fits all isn't going to fit for this specific, and I'm sure there's a lot of other issues like it, but so that they can, when there are these designated centers that are known for their expert care, that it's a little bit easier to get there.
Well, I know that, we can't solve that problem ourselves. We're not, lawmakers or regulators or any of those things. But I think having these conversations is the starting point to allow that to happen, so that you're an expert in this. You see the limitations. You can speak on, okay, this is what I would need to be able to do this the right way. And then these conversations can then evolve to, hopefully, you never know who's going to see something, right? So that is an important part of the piece of this is, identifying the problems, and even if it's just to air them that this is a problem and this is the resource, I think it is still an important thing. So, highlighting those limitations to care is an important part of keeping that ball rolling forward. So as we kind of start to wrap up a little bit, are there any specific call to actions you would want to give to the community for how they can get involved, anything you'd want from the community as a whole, and ways that people can get involved?
I think a lot of it is continuing the great things that are already happening. I've mentioned the BBS Foundation a few times, but the incredible partnership is a big part of, I think, why I've become so committed. It's it's an opportunity for me to actually make a difference.
Yep.
And that's, my goal as a scientist.
Yep.
And so, the BBS Foundation does a lot of great things. I think, get more involved. People in the community get more involved with the BBS Foundation. They're undergoing a lot of really great changes now. I think that, it's a good opportunity. It's a good opportunity to connect with the community. I like hearing directly from the community as well, but if the BBS Foundation's hearing things, I'm going to hear it too.
Sure.
It's a good conduit. And they fund Cribs, and they've been phenomenal partners. And so, I think that, getting involved with them, fundraising for them, doing other types of fundraising, I think, that, fundraising has a dual purpose. Yeah. And I know you know this very well. And I probably learned some of this from you, but that, when you're doing fundraising, it's also education.
Yeah.
And so, I think that, even if the fundraiser isn't generating, a lot of money, you're still educating people. Yep. And so, I think that those are the kind of the calls to action. I think, the other thing is that I'm getting more sort of comfortable myself with, and is that talk to your representatives,
Yep.
your U.S. Congress, your
Yep.
your local. I think, these are nonpartisan issues, really. I mean, you're bringing up a challenge that you're facing, and I think that you can see across the political spectrum that representatives, they latch onto these things, and this becomes their topic.
Yep.
And I think that find those people and get them to start working with us, and I think that they can help solve some of those barriers that anybody who looks at it and says, this doesn't need to be this way. This is this way for some other reason, but it's having this unintended effect. Yeah. And I think, all of those are kind of the ways that to advance things, to really, continue the great things that are happening.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'll just add to that, getting involved has a wide range of effects, like you said. The first being is it is actually very therapeutic. So, when we get these diagnoses, these, challenging things to face, is we can't control what happens to us in life. We can only control how we react to it. And by reacting to it, by getting involved in some way, whatever it is that you can offer, whether it's, being a community support member or a fundraiser or volunteering in some way, it takes back a little bit of that control. This thing happened to me that's out of my control, but now I'm taking back that control in making a difference and, controlling the narrative around it and having that element there, which is very therapeutic, because it is very hard to have a family member going through this and feeling like you can't help and you can't make a difference. So that is one really impactful thing that comes from just getting involved, volunteering, making a difference. And then I think, to, re-emphasize what you talked about with, the fundraising and stuff, is that everybody can make a difference. It all adds up. It all is there. So it doesn't matter whether, you can, support with $1 or something more than that, then it all adds up. It all makes a difference. And if we all band together and we all keep fighting for these things together, it really does add up. It really does make a huge difference. So just getting involved, connecting, having that community support around you is all the difference when it comes to facing a rare disease like BBS. So is there anything else that you want to bring up while we are having this conversation? We have the BBS community listening. Is there anything else to add, or have we hit all the high points for today?
I hope we have. I just, to kind of reiterate is that, we love to hear from the community. Yep. And that's part of why I encourage getting involved in Cribs. Yep. That will help, in terms of making us more attractive for research. People that are involved in Cribs, that way we, I mentioned how we recruited for the setmelanotide. We've recruited for other studies too. It doesn't have to be a Marshfield Clinic study or anything like that. That if a legitimate investigator reaches out to us for help with recruitment, then we can do that. And we can, so find people in a certain state or with various conditions or whatever. And so I think, that's another reason to get involved in Cribs and to provide more opportunity. But, so I think that's really, the thing that emphasized, but I think, we covered a lot of the important stuff.
Well, how can people get in touch with Marshfield Clinic? What's the website? What's the best way to reach out?
Yeah, so the CRIBS website is bbs-registry.org.
Okay.
And then at the Marshfield Clinic, it's, the marshfieldclinic.com, I think is the,
Okay.
and then find the, can navigate to the BBS clinics.
Awesome. Well, we'll be sure to actually include those links in the caption and everything in there. But I just want to make sure everybody knew that you guys are accessible, that you are very easy to connect with, and that reaching out is not a hard task. So
yeah, and I'll also add too. So the other is the Bardet-Biedl.org. That's the BBS
Yes.
Foundation. That that they're great, and if someone reaches out to them, and they'll help connect us.
Correct.
Too, and kind of vice versa. But they're an incredible advocacy organization. I mean, I think they're a model for other rare disease advocacy organizations.
Definitely.
And so I can't sort of speak highly enough and recommend them enough to people in the community.
Definitely. Well, thank you for everything you're doing for the community, for families and patients with BBS. We are all truly grateful. And thank you for sharing your time today to help provide this kind of permanent evergreen resource that will exist for patients. And hopefully we can continue to have more of these conversations over time. But thank you so much for coming out. I really appreciate it. And I know that the community will find it a great resource that they can refer to as they're navigating their BBS diagnosis.
Well, I want to say thank you for the opportunity, not only to speak here, but to the community as a whole, for the opportunity to apply my expertise in a way that has meaning.
Yes, well, it does, and you are making a huge impact.
Thank you.
Thanks.